All right, so moving right along here, we'll take a look at Antigone, which is really exciting. I think a lot of people like Antigone more than Oedipus. It's certainly a little less disturbing, and it's just great to have, a female protagonist here. And in many ways, it's kind of a sequel to Oedipus. We get to see the after effects of what we just studied, and so our understanding of the genre of tragic drama will deepen even more. So for recall, what are the traits of Oedipus's character? You map these out ideally as we were going through as you were reading or as you were listening to the last lecture. And so, we'll do our comparison of protagonists here, and we'll add number 6 to the list of protagonists, Antigone. So as a recall to kind of prepare us for that, what did we think of Oedipus? What was he like? And then you could recap, remind yourself those 5 steps of Aristotle's pattern for the perfect tragedy, because Oedipus really follows those. And then every play after Oedipus could potentially follow them as well, but probably deviate some. And I think Antigone kind of plays with those steps a little bit. That'd be fun to think about. So we already went through the historical context of the author, so I'll just give a little bit of background very quickly on the play Antigone itself, and then we'll get right to the action. It's not necessarily a sequel to Oedipus, but another play which Sophocles wrote first, based on the pre-existing Oedipus myth. So it is a sequel, as in it deals with the events afterwards, and I would say it's especially a sequel because we see the aftermath of Oedipus's actions, the effects of them on his family and community. And that's a really important aspect of Antigone to study. It'll be one of your discussion board questions. But like I said, because Sophocles based both of these plays on pre-existing mythology, much like Homer based his epic poems on pre-existing mythology about the Trojan War, the general story of Oedipus was already known. And so even though it is a sequel, he actually wrote it first and then later on wrote Oedipus. But of course, we're looking at them in this order so that the narrative just makes sense. Something that's really important here, the whole play hinges on the idea of properly burying the dead, which is an important part of Greek society going all the way back to the Iliad. I mean, that's what drives Achilles back into the war when Patroclus' body is being disrespected, and then he disrespects Hector's body. And getting Hector's body so they can properly bury him is Priam's motivation for crossing the border and trying to commune with Achilles, and then his conversation with Achilles and their mutual great grief is what leads to the transformation of Achilles' play and the culmination of everything that happens in that poem. So burying the dead is incredibly important to the Greeks, and it's at the center of this play. But I would argue that it's important to all of us, right? When we lose someone, we want to mourn them properly, and how we treat their body is part of that. It's why people don't want autopsies performed on their loved ones sometimes. And so, in a way, this play teaches us something very specific to the Greek culture, but it's a part of Greek culture that, even if we don't emphasize it quite as much, is still very important to us today. And so, Antigone is probably, I would say, one of the most eminently relatable protagonists of anyone we study. And with this, so burying the dead is kind of the central conflict in the play, but what is that conflict really about? And there's 2 moral stances here, one represented by Antigone, one represented by Creon. And so one way to conceptualize, frame, or think about this play is an ongoing debate between Antigone and Creon. And what are the views they represent? So the view Antigone represents is burial rites in the law of the gods, you could say, because the gods in ancient Greek literature and mythology really placed importance on burying the dead. Creon, though, he's now king. He's Oedipus's brother-in-law / uncle, Yui, and he's now king. There's this power vacuum. Again, it's a sequel, right? Once Oedipus is gone, so he's now king, and both of Oedipus's sons fight over power of the city, and they both die. That's the context, the setting. And one of them was supporting Creon, and the other one was not. And so that other one is a traitor. And Creon denies him a proper burial. And he's saying, We have to treat traitors this way. And if I were to give him a proper burial, I would look weak in front of the people, and I would fail as a leader. And we're a community at a crossroads, on a precipice, and we're divided because Oedipus was a great leader, but he had a tragic past. That truth has come out, and now he's gone. We need a good leader. How can I be a good leader if I properly bury traitors? And so they both have very legitimate claims, and those claims butt heads here, and that's the center conflict of the play. Again, psychological depth and complexity of characters is incredibly important. We saw how Oedipus went a step further than the Odyssey, which Odysseus, before Oedipus, was probably our most psychologically complex character. Now I think we go even a step further. So even though we just talked about their moral stances, neither Antigone or Creon can be fully reduced to a single moral stance. In other words, they represent certain moral ideas, burial rites versus community bonds, generally speaking, but their perspectives are very complex and nuanced. So we shouldn't just reduce them to these things they represent. And so I think, we keep going. We keep getting deeper characters here. And that's something that's just beautiful about the progress and development of world literature over these early centuries in the Greek Empire. All right. So that's kind of setting us up. Those are the things we'll look at. 1, the aftermath of Oedipus. 2, the central conflict of Antigone. The law of the gods versus communal law. And then finally, the complexity of the characters. So what are some reading questions I asked you to think about as you were studying this work? You could go into more detail with the aftermath of Oedipus's actions. I ask you that because these plays operate the way the Iliad and the Odyssey do, where they were written by authors for audiences who knew the pre-existing mythology, who knew the events of the Trojan War, who knew the legend of Oedipus and knew the legend of Antigone. And so there's all this background. The two brothers, Oedipus's two sons, fighting, dying, one being buried properly, one not. Antigone fighting for her brother to be buried properly. That all happens off stage before the play starts. And you need to know that to understand the play. So by posing this reading question, I've asked you to seek it out. But on another level, it goes deeper than that. It goes beyond just context. It goes to theme. Thematically, what is the aftermath here? You have a city divided and on a precipice because their good leader is gone and fallen in their eyes. So it's maybe a country not unlike our own today. And that's why we'll come back to this for the discussion board. And then blindness was so important to Oedipus, right? He's blind. He cannot see. Then he has recognition, and to symbolically and ironically represent that, blinds himself. Blindness is a theme that continues on in Antigone. And so let's go ahead then with those two questions in mind, thinking about what is the aftermath of Oedipus and what ways do we see blindness in this play. Let's kind of go through the play now, and I'll ask some questions, and then we'll look at some quotes. But again, I would say the proper way to frame this is to think about it as a conflict between Antigone and Creon over what should be done with her brother's body. Should he be buried properly, even though he was a traitor? And Antigone argues that burial rites trump the laws of a city, that this is a greater thing. It doesn't matter that he was a traitor. What matters is that he's a person, a citizen, a brother. He deserves a proper burial. And so I kind of like when I teach this face-to-face, I like to ask students, what do you think? Like, whose side are you on? And so I think Antigone is the title character. And we should compare her to Oedipus, to Odysseus, to Achilles, to Jacob, to Gilgamesh, to whomever we want. And it'll be a fascinating study. But I think we also have to take Creon, even though he's not in the title, almost equally, and ask, what do you think of him? And what's interesting is I think Antigone has this position to which we can very much relate. She's very sympathetic. She is this heroine who we just love. And I love her too. She's a wonderful character, and I feel for her. If this were my brother, I'd be doing what she's doing. So on the one hand, she's this great, powerful character, but she's eminently relatable. We can all sympathize with her. It's harder for us to sympathize with Creon, and that's why I like to ask these two questions of students. Because is he sympathetic at all? Can you understand his position? He's trying to lead people in the aftermath of a great tragedy. They need a good leader. I think he could be that leader. He has the potential. He's a leadership type. He's a guy who was kind of groomed to be king. And if he buries a traitor, how does that look properly? How does that look to his people? Will that unite the people? Will it divide the people? I don't know what the right answer is, but I think the fact that he's laboring over this and sticking to his guns does make him somewhat sympathetic, even if he's not eminently sympathetic or relatable like Antigone. But he's also, a lot of people see him as a villain. A lot of people are like, why won't this jerk just bury this guy properly? And so that's why I love to hear what students think of this, and that's why we'll come back to this on the discussion board. But I suggest now you pause, jot down your thoughts on this so that when you look at the quotes, you kind of have your impressions of Antigone and your impressions of Creon in mind. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to look at two quotes for this text because they're both very long quotes. And one will outline Creon's position and the other will outline Antigone's position. So we could see how using both logic and emotion, we could see how they both could be right. So here's Creon's position. But his blood kin, his brother, Polynices, who came back from exile with intent to burn with fire from top to bottom his own fatherland and his own family gods, intent to gorge himself on blood he shared and make his countrymen his slaves. This city has received a proclamation not to honor him with funeral rites or wail for him, but all must leave his body unentombed to be the food of the birds and the dogs, an outrage to behold. Such is my purpose. Never shall evil men be held in higher honor than the just, at least by me. But he who bears goodwill towards this city will be honored by me equally in life and death. So you can see how he set a proclamation, a law. He's sticking to his guns. He's going to follow it. In some respects, that's a noble thing to do. And he's painted Polynices here as a villain. Now, we don't know all the details. And this myth, this legend from Greek mythology has been retold countless times by different writers, although we don't necessarily have access to all those. So we don't know all the nuances. What exactly did Polynices do? Is he truly a traitor? Is he as villainous as Creon paints him here? We can't say for sure, but we do know what Creon has chosen to do. And as wrong as he may be, I think deep down he truly believes that this is the best choice for his people. I don't think he sees it, at least initially here, as a selfish choice. And to a certain extent, you can see the logic of it. He's trying to say, if this guy really was going to come back and attack the city and try to take it over, then maybe he shouldn't be buried properly. Creon is trying, I'm not trying to defend him, but I'm trying to point out what he's doing. He's trying to establish a standard and a system for justice, which most people desire and is, generally speaking, a good thing. And so we can see what he's trying to do here. So then what's the problem? If we can see it from Creon's perspective, and we can see why he would do some of these things, what's the problem? Well, back to the origin of all problems, pride. It's also not a good thing that he sticks to his guns, right? Maybe there should be exceptions to some laws. Maybe there should be moments where we think about the person and not just the rule of law. Maybe there's moments where we can make an exception and not give up justice. Those aren't questions with easy or right or wrong answers necessarily, but they're important central questions to understanding what it means to be human. And they're questions that Creon doesn't deign to answer. So his pride, much like Oedipus, blinds him. And he never wavers from this stance. He never turns back from this stance. He never makes an exception to this stance. And that, rather than the stance itself, is truly the problem. How far does he go with his blindness? Well, we'll answer that soon. But first, let's take a look at Antigone's perspective. which is the perspective that I think most of us can relate to. And we have a powerful speech from her here that shows why she's rightfully such a beloved character. It was not Zeus who made this proclamation. So she's referring to the same proclamation Creon made, which is that traitors will not be buried properly. Nor was it justice dwelling with the gods below, who set in place such laws as these for humankind. Nor did I think your proclamations had such strength that, mortal as you are, you could outrun those laws that are the gods, unwritten and unshakable. Their laws are not for now or for yesterday, but live forever. No one knows when first they came to light. I was not going to pay the gods just penalty for breaking these, dreading the purposes of a mere man. I knew that I must die. How could I not, regardless of the proclamation that you made? But if I die before my time, I count that as a profit, a gain. How can death not profit one who lives, surrounded by as many evils as myself? For me, therefore, to meet this doom is equal to no grief at all. But if I had endured the son of my own mother to lie dead without a grave, that would have brought me grief. But I am not grieved by this. And if you think my present deeds are foolishness, perhaps the one who calls me foolish is the fool. That's what I call good writing. And if you want to get people to like a character, write a speech like that. Good on you, Sophocles. And so those words there, that would have brought me grief, but I'm not grieved by this. That and this are in italics. That's how it is in the original play. I didn't do that. So there's a few important things going on here. In the first few lines, it was not Zeus who made this proclamations. Through the next few lines, she's talking about the laws of the gods. The gods say people must be buried properly. Creon, by making a law that says we don't bury traitors properly, is defying the gods, but he's making a law that he thinks will benefit the people of his city, of which he's now king. He thinks that not burying traitors, even though it disobeys the gods, will unite his people. That's what he believes. And Antigone is saying, no, I have to obey the gods first and foremost. There is a higher law beyond the law of this city. And so she says things like, mortal as you are, you thought you could outrun those laws that are unwritten, unshakable. Like she's saying, the gods are going to get you, buddy, because you've defied them. And she's saying the laws of the gods are not for now or yesterday, but live forever. They're eternal. So you've got, like, Creon is focused on the immediate, the what's happening right now. Antigone's focused on the bigger picture, the eternal. That the laws of gods last longer than the laws of men, is what she's saying there. And so she's saying, I was not going to pay their penalty. Creon he's the king. He can penalize her. He can punish her. In just a minute, this quote's about to shift to the fact of her impending execution. But prior to that, she says, even though he could punish her, she'd much more fear the punishment of the gods than his punishment. And then she shifts to actually talking about the fact that he's basically told her that you're going to be executed. She's saying, I don't care. If I die before my time, that's a good thing. How could being alive be good if I'm surrounded by evil as this? She really gets him there. And she says, to die is not grief. If I had not buried my brother properly, because she actually went and did it, right? And that's why she's going to be executed here. That would be much worse. That would be a grief. Dying is nothing compared to the sin of disobeying the gods and the sin of not giving my brother a proper burial. So, and she says, if you think this is foolish, you might actually be the fool. So that's kind of throwing some irony at him there. You may think this is foolish, but perhaps the reality underneath the surface is that you're foolish. So she's got an incredibly strong argument. Appealing to the gods is the strongest argument you can make in ancient Greek society at any point in time. But she also appeals, I think, to this human nature, this feeling we have of family. She starts out by talking about the gods, but she ends by talking about her mother's son, her brother. I said these speeches both had logic and emotion. We can see the logic of setting a standard for justice in Creon's speech, and we can see the emotion of a man put in a difficult position in Creon's speech. Antigone's speech, we can see the logic of doing what the gods say you're supposed to do. But we can see the emotion of, if I had endured the son of my own mother to lie dead without a grave, that would have brought me grief, but I'm not grieved by this. And most of us, we probably all have various faiths and beliefs, but most of us probably today, I'm hazard to guess, don't believe in the Greek gods. But we all have family, and so we can all relate to what she's saying there. So that's where the emotion comes into it. And so both speeches have both emotion and logic, and both are convincing. You may think Antigone's position is more convincing, and that's totally fair, but they're both reasonable when you step back and look at them. And that's what makes this a powerful play, is you have two reasonable perspectives butting up against each other. You can't simply say this person is right and this person is wrong. That's what makes it tragedy. That's what makes it good drama. So some things to think about here before we finish out. The one thing I should note is the way this play resolves is, of course, Antigone dies, but Creon's son was in love with her, and they were betrothed. They were going to get married. Before all of this tragedy happened, the families were excited for them to get married. And then, at Antigone's death, Creon's son takes his own life, and at his death, Creon's wife takes her own life. So just like Oedipus, Creon loses everything. And I think as impassioned and as complex and nuanced as Antigone's position is, she goes through less change than Creon. So one question to think about is, does Creon experience the steps of Aristotle's outline for tragedy at the end when he learns of his son's death and his wife's death? Does he have recognition? Is there catharsis? And we might have some catharsis with Antigone, but is there recognition? Because did Antigone do anything wrong? And if she didn't do anything wrong, is she really a tragic hero? And the play is, I think, rightly named for her, but is it really more Creon's story? So I wanted to kind of map out the ending of the play there and kind of start to poke with some initial questions. And those questions I just asked will be fleshed out more fully here. And because this is such a complex, nuanced, wonderful play, I've got a lot of questions for you to choose from. So simply, first, whose side do you take? And are your reasons more emotional or logical, or both? Antigone is so important because she's, in the history of world literature, she's the first strong female protagonist. Remember, we're studying world literature from the beginning of time, up to basically the birth of Christ. So these are the pieces we have today, and they're the most famous ones. And we've had some powerful, important female characters so far, but this one gets her own title. The play is named after her, so she's important. But what is it about her that makes her so significant? Like I said, Creon is the character who goes through change and growth and depth, where she's the one who goes through growth and depth there. She's, I don't want to say she's one note because her position is complex, but she doesn't change the way Creon does. But there's something about her. People just love her, and I do too. So what is that? And then, like I said, the aftermath of Oedipus's actions are really important here. So talk about that more. Think about it more than you already have, and if you'd like to, talk about it on the discussion board. It runs deep because there's the irony, there's the aftermath of people finding out the truth, there's what he did in the first place, there's the fact that he didn't know he was doing it. There's so much to consider there, but we see it play out here. This is not a stable kingdom because of what Oedipus did, but how much do we really blame him? So, this question is connected to the first set of questions, and it's very important. And again, we come back to blindness, the other reading question, because blindness is so important. So, love to hear you or read what you have to say about that. Because Creon is blind, right? And you could almost argue Antigone is blind, right? She can't seem to see things from the other perspective, but it's not tragic for her. Part of the reason I picked that quote of all the quotes I could have picked, the quote we just went through, was she's dying, right? She's about to be executed, but she's totally fine with that. But you could still argue that she's blind because she never tries to see things from his perspective. Whereas on the other hand, he's got the same problem. He never tries to see things from her perspective, but he loses everything. And he has to live on and lead these people knowing that he effectively killed his wife and his son. Oedipus literally killed his father and married his mother. But Creon, because of his pride, because of his blindness, killed them, did things that led to their deaths directly. Yet he's perhaps not any more blind than Antigone. So why the difference? It's fascinating. And then you should talk about the other characters if you want. Ismene, Haman. I think especially Haman is really important. The play, the reason why it's a tragedy, because according to Antigone, what she says, what happens to her is not a tragedy. We might view it as a tragedy because we love her, but she doesn't view it as a tragedy, at least in these circumstances. She's doing what she wanted to do. She's getting the punishment she knew she'd get, and she's fine with that. So what makes it a tragedy is Haman, and it makes it a tragedy for Creon. And Ismene, the dialogue between the sisters is very important as well. So if you'd like to focus on one of these other characters besides Antigone and Creon, that'd be great. And I think that's one of these things that makes this play wonderful, because Oedipus, Jocasta is important, Tiresias plays a role, you see Creon there, but really Oedipus is the focus of Oedipus. Here, not only do you have Antigone going against Creon, you've got these other characters who are very pivotal. So in terms of the plot, it's a little more complex, even though it's technically a shorter play. And then I ask, does either Antigone or Creon follow the progression for a tragic hero outlined by Aristotle, right? That would make a perfect drama, according to Aristotle. And so we've seen how Oedipus follows it almost exactly, almost precisely. But do either of these characters follow it precisely as Oedipus? And if they don't, if they deviate, to what degree? A character doesn't have to follow it as precisely as Oedipus for us to be able to have a good conversation about it. And so, Creon, I think, comes closer. And like I said, Antigone does seem kind of one note, as powerful and compelling as she is, but you could make a case for Antigone. I'd love to listen to that argument and see how you defend it. I think that would make for great reading for me. And this progression outlined by Aristotle is really informative for drama. You can ask it of Shakespeare. It's really what makes anything we watch or read compelling. It's kind of a variation on the hero's journey in that sense. And does Creon grow as a character through the course of the play? You could ask the same thing about Oedipus. Do they grow and change in the way the epic heroes do? Does recognition and catharsis involve growth? Does Creon have recognition and catharsis? Questions 6 and 7 are related. Finally, you can talk about the differences between the epic and the tragedy as genres. As I said, we've moved for the first time in a while from the genre, the main genre we've been reading, with a few exceptions, most of the class, to an entirely new genre. What are the differences? What is significant about those differences? And use specific examples from Antigone to talk about this, if you pick this question, because this is a question from the Antigone list. But now you've seen a couple examples with Oedipus and Antigone to help you think about that. So, incredibly complex, nuanced, fascinating play. I hope you enjoyed it. And more than anything, I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts on it.